We'll hear a prompt. Great. So now I would like to pass the session to our presenter for today, Alison. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Salisa, and good afternoon, everybody. I nearly said good morning because I'm actually zooming in from a very sunny United Kingdom at the moment. So you can probably see the sun kind of coming through my window. But it is lovely to have so many of you joining us for this webinar. And really the big message for this webinar this afternoon is that learning never stops. So we're going to really try and explore over the next 30 minutes how we can really think about what learning looks like and how we might be able to keep it going for our young learners and their families, whether they are in school, whether they're learning online, or, as I know lots of you are starting to do, moving towards learning using a blended model. Now, I know you're going to be a fantastic group because already you have been entering into the chat box your name and which country you're based in, even before I put that up. So brilliant, fantastic participants. So please keep doing that. If you haven't had the opportunity yet to use the chat box, it's a really good opportunity just to have a go if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, or just to connect with the other participants that are in the room. It's also really helpful if you want to indicate your role, entirely up to you, and also perhaps what you're looking forward to learning about today. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat box, but there are lots of you in the room today, and I've got a full packed 30 minutes to get through, so apologies if I don't pick things up as we're going through, but I am really delighted that you're all here with me. So this is what it's going to look like. We're going to do roughly a 30 minutes presentation and then around about 20-25 minutes of questions and answers. And as Salisa said earlier, apologies if we don't get to all of your questions. And I'm also hoping that as you're popping in some of those questions as we go through the webinar, I will actually have addressed some of those points that you're making as well. So we're going to really try and explore those 2 bullet points that you can see on your screen. So how can we keep our primary age learners learning, whether they are learning at home or at school? Now, I put in primary age learners because this webinar really is a result of one of the blogs that I wrote for Cambridge Assessments, International Education, which you can find on the homepage for Cambridge. And the blog was centred on primary age learners. But actually, on reflection, everything that I'm talking about today really is applicable for all age of learners. But that's what we're really going to try and think about. How can we keep learning going, no matter where we are, at home, at school, or in a blended model? And then, of course, that learning depends on how we manage to keep our learners motivated, how we maintain their confidence, and above all, what we really want them to do is to look forward to coming back to school when we can come back to school full-time, face-to-face. So that's really what I'm going to try and talk with you through this afternoon. So before I move on, I have a question to ask you, and it is a reflective question, but we're talking about learning. So if somebody asked you, what is learning? What would you say? And you can pop that in the chat box if you like to, but it's a really good question just to reflect on as we start thinking about moving forward and thinking about keeping learning going. So what is learning? And what would it look like? What does learning look like for you? And what does learning look like for your learners? Because if we can really think about what learning looks like and how we then might be able to facilitate it, we will start to see that we can think a little bit differently, but actually we can think about how to support it. So I can already see people are saying it's about knowing, it's about learning something new, it's about knowing unknown things, something which we can use all the time. So the wholesome development of a child, what a lovely expression, I love that. Continuous process of discovery, getting new skills. So lovely, keep those going. I'm going to keep moving on, but I know you will be able to read the chat box and listen as I move on, but thank you for that. So what I want to do, thinking about this learning, is to consider the 3 possible scenarios that we have. So the first one is when we're learning at school, what does that look like? How is that packaged up? So we know that the learning is timetabled. So for example, our learners know what time they need to be at school. They know what time their lessons are taking place. They know that it's organised, and therefore it's very focused for learners. They don't actually have any flexibility or any choice as to whether they want to go to the mathematics lesson in the morning or the science lesson in the afternoon. It is organised, it's sorted for them, and therefore they accept it. They come to school with an acceptance that they're going to these certain places and that they're going to be learning some things, and they get on with it. They even know when they're stopping for breaks and when they're stopping for lunch. The teacher is familiar, so they know who their teachers are, whether they have one teacher or multiple teachers, and the teacher is qualified. And we don't get any learners that turn up to school and say, well, are you qualified to teach me English, or, you know, are you qualified to teach me mathematics? It is again that acceptance that because they're learning at school, those things are a given. And therefore that teacher is always present, and I mean in a face-to-face physical contact, and also that teacher is trusted. And so we don't have to think about those things. They again are those givens. And then, of course, there is access to resources, whatever they might be, whether we're talking about textbooks or paper and pencils or science equipment or mathematical equipment. We have access to resources, but of course we have access to peers as well. And I'll come back to all of these things as we go on to the second scenario. So that learning at school, if we can think about what learning at school offers, we can then start to think about how it might look differently when we're learning at home. And of course, learning at home, we have a choice. And I think probably most of you have been experimenting with learning and teaching synchronously and also asynchronously. And of course, synchronous learning offers routine and it offers structure to the day. So again, we're trying to mirror some of the learning that's happening in school. And for our younger learners, that can be a real advantage, particularly if they haven't been attending school for very long. It gives them that sense of routine. It shows that there are expectations attached to their learning, and it helps to set the right tone for when they do return. It's also important because it offers that connection to their teacher or several teachers, and whether you're communicating through audio or video, the fact that somebody is there at the same time as you, as a learner, you can see your teacher there and then, that's really comforting and it's helpful, and it helps to maintain those connections. Of course, asynchronous learning has also very many advantages. The biggest one, of course, is that it offers that flexibility, which of course we don't necessarily have that flexibility in organisation and structure when we're learning at school. And of course, that's particularly helpful using asynchronous learning if we're hoping to use some of the adults, the parents at home as well. And again, I'll come back to that point later. So learning at home, we know, can be synchronous and asynchronous. But one of the things that I want you to really think about is that actually the learning at home takes a longer period of time. So I might set a task at school and expect it to take 30 minutes. I can set the same task at home and it will take longer than 30 minutes. And there are lots of reasons for that. But one of them is, again, the learners are not in that structure. They're not in that mindset of being at school. They haven't got the motivation of watching other learners get on with the work, or the motivation of watching you doing some scaffolding. So that the fact that learning takes longer at home is a really important point for us to consider when we are planning our learning at home, our virtual lessons. And of course, learning at home can be lonely as well. There may be other siblings, there may be other adults, and of course we can use breakout rooms in platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, but it's not the same. It's not the same as learning at school. So again, we need to think about the tasks that we're asking our learners to do if they're learning at home, and consider that, you know, they are potentially learning on their own. And of course, there are two different teachers. There are two teachers. You have the teacher yourselves, for example, who's setting the work, but you also have the what I call the temporary teacher, who's at home, the parents, the adults who are there, who are desperately trying to support their learners, and they're using different skill sets. And again, I'm going to pick up that point in 2 slides' time about some of the ways that we can support our parents with that learning. And I noticed a question that came into, I think it was the Q&A box a little earlier on, that said, how do we lessen the burden for parents? Well, hopefully I'm going to give you some tips to think about there. And of course, learning at home, there is going to be limited access to resources. So some of the activities that we might have taken from the schemes of work when we're learning at school, we might need to think about how to adapt them for the home environment. I've looked quite extensively at the Cambridge schemes of work, and there are not that many things that I couldn't replicate at home. But of course, it might be that certain things I do need to shift. So I need to manipulate the scheme of work so that actually when we are back in school, I know that I'm going to shift some of the things, particularly the things that I need a specialist equipment for, so that I'm not going to teach that learning when learners are at home. I'm going to wait until they're back into school. And I've already mentioned that, you know, there is limited access to peers. So let's think about the third option, which is the learning at home and at school, that blended model. And I think almost all of the teachers and all of the countries that I've been working with over the last 4 months are really starting to move towards thinking about this blended model, where some of the learning is going to be at home and some of the learning is going to be at school. And the big thing for us to remember here is that whenever we're planning lessons for home or at school, expectations need to be different. So the quantity of work we set at school is going to be higher than the quantity of work we set at home. The number of tasks we ask our learners to do at school are going to be different, both in the terms of quantity, but also in terms of the nature of the task. They're going to be different. So it's really just thinking about, will this task be completed at home or at school? And therefore, how am I thinking about setting that up? And of course, that time allowed. Time learning at home takes longer. But the big things that I really want you to think about also is that consistency and that continuity. So for consistency, we really want to make sure, if we're going towards a blended model, that actually what learners are doing at home complements what they're doing at school. Now, you will have lots of different blended models. I think I've seen them all over the last couple of months. So I've worked with schools who have a blended model where one day the learners are at home, but then the next day they're at school, and they kind of alternate like that. I've had other models where 2 or 3 days are at home and then 2 or 3 days are in school. And equally, I've had schools which have brought learners in for weeks at a time. So learners will be learning at home for a week, and then they'll come to school and they learn at school for a week. So that blended model, depending on which kind of variation you're using, is really interesting. But the biggest message is, what can we ask our learners to do at home that they can then helpfully, build on at school? And of course, what if they don't complete the home tasks for whatever reason? There are going to be some learners who don't complete those home tasks. And we need to be mindful that actually we're not giving them potentially lots of new learning to be doing at home, that if they're not going to do it, they're going to miss out, and the gaps between the learning is going to widen. So again, one of the biggest opportunities that we have learning at home is that consolidation of learning. And again, so we've got consolidation of learning, we've got retrieval of knowledge, and then we've got the new learning. And I would be really encouraging you to really think about the new learning, to try and keep it into the school context, if at all possible. So of course it is going to look different, but we really want to try and make sure that continuity is there. I mentioned the temporary teacher a couple of slides ago, and I really feel for parents. I'm a parent. I've been trying to cope with supporting my daughter with her online learning, and it's hard. And I'm trying to do the best I can, but I know I'm not doing it in the same way as the teacher. So I think we need to acknowledge that parents have their own set of skills, and they have a really good set of skills that actually we can draw on and make the most of this situation that we're in. So rather than kind of viewing it as, well, how do I train up the parent to be a teacher? Let's look at it from the other perspective. Let's look at what the parents can support us doing in our role as teachers. So they are very good, parents, at asking questions. And actually, because they can instill that confidence and success in a different way than we can, the learners have bespoke, one-to-one, focused attention. So let's really enable the parents to ask the right questions by giving them some questions to ask. Let's say to them, praise is really, really important. It's not about necessarily task completion. It's about just engaging with the task. It doesn't matter whether the learners get the answers right or wrong, because actually the learning skills are really important. And of course, we know that parents have those high expectations, but they're not the teacher. They don't understand potentially the correct learning trajectories that we do. So they might say, well, we don't understand why you're doing it in this order, or my daughter or my son, they can get the answers. Why, do they need to do something more difficult? And sometimes it's about communicating with our parents and saying, I know they can do this, but actually consolidation of learning, retrieval of knowledge is as important as getting the right answer as learning something new. And so again, that was why I wanted to ask you that question at the beginning about what is learning. And we are all learning all of the time, but it might just look a little bit different to the learning that happens in school. So let's really help our parents to become that stand-in teacher, but use the skills that they are bringing, not try and give them the skills that we want them to replicate from our point of view. So for example, I saw a lovely PowerPoint a couple of weeks ago that one of my teachers had sent out, and it was actually a maths PowerPoint, and it was for very young learners, actually 4 and 5-year-olds, and the PowerPoint was asking the learners to go and explore patterns around the house and outside. And it was lovely, and the teacher had given some examples in the PowerPoint. But the very first screen, which I loved, said, this screen is just for the grown-ups. And that what the teacher had done is that she'd written a few helpful hints to the parents to say, so this is why we're doing this at these activities. I think, it will take, maybe 2 or 3 days. You don't need to sit down, all in one go. So you can spread out the learning, you can spread out the activities. It would be really helpful if you asked these questions. And so for the parents receiving their very own bespoke, slide for grown-ups, it made them feel valued. It made them feel part of the learning. They knew exactly what to do. They didn't go off on a tangent on the learning, so that the teachers were still in control of what their learners were learning, but it was that high level of communication, and that has really worked. So that might be something to think about. We've really talked about offline and online. And again, in order to keep that learning going and to support our young learners and our families, we just need to be mindful that, the technology is so varied at the moment. And the technology could be to do with access to laptops or computers or tablets, but it also could be access to Wi-Fi as well. So again, when we're setting that learning, whether it's online or offline, we perhaps need to give a mixture of both. So if it's constantly online, your learners might be struggling to have their turn, for example, on the laptop, or perhaps the Wi-Fi, the broadband isn't very strong at the particular time you want to do synchronous learning. So I think my message here is try and vary the tasks that you give, so that some of the tasks are definitely offline tasks. And you can say to your learners, actually, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 days to have a think about completing these tasks. And when we meet again, either online through synchronous technology, or when you're in school, it would be really helpful if you have completed these tasks. So I think it's just that assumption that we don't assume that learners have access to technology and broadband 24/7. The other thing to really think about is that, we learn when we're happy. We learn when we feel safe. We learn when we feel valued. And so when we're thinking about what school offers learners, it offers much more than just a place for academic learning. We offer that security to our learners when they're in that building, when they're with their peers, when they're with their teachers. We take the time to notice if they are okay. We take the time to notice and ask them what they've been doing, what they've been up to. We get to know them. And so for learners, it's a very social as well as academic place. When we move to online learning, it's really difficult sometimes to maintain that social contact. And so there are a few things that you can be doing. So the first thing is to sometimes build in opportunities where actually you're bringing your learners together, possibly through a synchronous online session, but the whole purpose is just to say to them, so how are you? What have you been doing? Tell me something that you've been doing recently. You know, oh, I noticed, Hannah, that, you know, you're wearing something new, or any of those things, just so that your learners feel that they have a connection. I've noticed that somebody's put in the chat box that it's a second home for learners. You're absolutely right. They do see it as that. So when they are learning at home, they've lost that second home. They've lost that contact. And we know that, you know, we're probably very different when we are communicating through technology. You know, if I'm in the room with you, if any of you have been in a session with me, you'll know that I walk around a lot. I use my hands a lot, but I'm up and down, and I'm making sure that I've got contact with everybody. And you will be doing the same when you're in the classroom. It's very hard to do that when you're online. So it's just pausing and reflecting that actually, you know, remember that your learners are missing you. They're missing their friends, they're missing their peers, but that face-to-face contact isn't the same if it's online. So let's plan and incorporate and reflect on this element. And therefore, this is all really helping for our learners to keep learning. Linked to that, of course, is motivation. And we know that, you know, again, if we are feeling successful, if we're feeling motivated, we are more likely to want to learn. And we really want to keep that ability, that perseverance, that resilience to learn. We really want to keep that going. And I've noticed that over the 4 months that we've had circuit breakers and lockdowns, that actually sometimes we lose that motivation, or our learners lose that motivation to keep learning, to keep online. So it's really thinking about, well, how can we instill that self-belief in them? How can we make sure that we are constantly praising them, that really trying to say to them, actually, you know, I noticed that you did that really well. Did everybody notice Hannah's word that she used? Did everybody notice what Hannah did in the maths bit? I use Hannah, by the way, because that's my daughter's name, so I think I'm not offending anybody. But really kind of, you know, making sure that as a teacher, we're noticing what they're doing. Again, a lovely comment in the chat box about celebrating their birthdays. Just knowing if that week, you know, they've had a birthday or they've had some sort of celebration makes all the difference, because your learners will think that you're thinking about them constantly, which of course you are. So one of the ways that we can keep this motivation going is thinking about, so what are the learners interested in? So let's ask them, let's ask what they're interested in, and let's try and use some of their interests in the teaching and the planning that we're doing. It's not going to be potentially in the scheme of work, but that doesn't matter because the skills are still there. If you strip away some of the activities that are linked to the skills, then actually we can replace some of those specific activities with ones that we could be doing at home. Thinking about what they can achieve. It's really important to think about, as I mentioned earlier, the amount of time that learning at home seems to take. So if we are setting the same amount of quantity of work that we would be setting in school, your learners are going to potentially not be able to achieve it all, again, for a variety of reasons. It might be that some of the sessions you have are celebration sessions, or you might build into part of your synchronous online learning sessions just 5 or 10 minutes where you don't do any task setting, any learning, any teaching, but you just pause and you celebrate what your learners have been doing. Again, we don't need to do much to keep that motivation doing, but we really need to think about actually that motivation is linked to learners carrying on learning. And of course, they're going to be learning some new skills at home. Excuse me. I've watched my daughter and she's been learning some really new skills, particularly with technology. She's doing things that I didn't know she could do. And so rather than kind of saying, well, is that part of your schoolwork? I've been able to say, wow, that's amazing. I didn't know you could do that. Can you teach me? So really thinking about those things that they can be doing. And I think really this kind of lends itself, the online learning, the blended learning model, really trying to make the most of all learning contexts. And it sounds easy to do, I know it isn't, but really trying to think about, so these tasks the learners are going to be doing at home. Is that possible? Have they got the resources? Have they got the inclination? Have they got the motivation? Have I given them enough time? When they're coming into school, have I linked the learning that they were doing at home to the learning that they're doing at school, either face-to-face in school or perhaps through synchronous online sessions? Because if learners can see that continuity and that consistency between what they're doing at home and what they're doing at school, they're going to be more likely to carry it on. So it's really about looking for learning opportunities everywhere. And this is a perfect opportunity for us to be thinking about applying learning, and really, again, particularly if they're at home, applying the learning that they've learnt rather than learning new learning. Again, I would really encourage that as much as possible. It is tempting, of course, when we are learning at home to use lots of textbooks, to use lots of worksheets, because as a teacher, it's easier to control what our learners are doing. And also your learners potentially have the textbooks or they have the worksheets that they can access. And that's okay. That's okay to do that for part of the time. But I would really look to be using the indoor and the outdoor spaces as well. And really thinking about being a little bit more creative, if we can, with the types of activities that we might suggest. So, for example, we could set our learners a challenge of, noticing how many times do we use numbers in the day? Is there a number that we use more than once? Why is that? Could we make a book of all of the numbers that we use? Could you then show me what the biggest number is, what the smallest number is? Could you take two of those numbers that you've used and add them together? So we're generating numbers and we're generating some mathematics from the home situation, but we're still doing the skills that we want them to be doing, which is in the scheme of work. Science is a really good example. Now, there's going to be a lot of science activities that are going to be difficult to replicate in the home. So the first thing I would do is I would look at the scheme of work and I would shift those kind of activities to a time when perhaps in 6 months' time, hopefully we're back in school full time. So let's think about the science that our learners can be doing at home. So they can be doing things like looking at changing states, for example. So changing bread to toast. What's happening there? What about watching ice melt? Can they watch ice melt? Can they set up an experiment of their own? How long does it take? Does each ice cube take the same amount of time to melt? What's happening from an ice cube melting to becoming a puddle of water? Can you take a photo of it? Can you talk to me about what you think's happening? Can you go on a walk and do some sorting and classifying? Now that could be mathematics or it could be science. Could you make a list of things that you've been doing today? So really bringing in some of those literacy and English skills. Things like cooking, great opportunity to be talking, to be explaining, to be reasoning. All of these things are learning, but they might look a little bit different to the learning that's happening in school. And of course, perhaps asking your learners to write a diary or to draw a picture of what they've been doing or to take a photograph to show. Lots of these things are brilliant opportunities that we can be doing in this situation here and now. So I think the big message is that if we are learning at home, let's make the most of it. Let's be creative. Let's do the things that we possibly can't do when the learners are at school, because whatever they're doing, they are learning. Again, it's just shifting our expectations of what that learning looks like. And of course, we know that if we alter our expectations, depending on the context, then we're going to keep that learning going. And remember, this is really about keeping it going so that your learners are really hungry, they're really desperate to get back to school as well. So in summary, I think that the thing to think about, and I know we're all really worried about this, that probably the question I get asked the most is, but what if they're not getting through the syllabus? What if they're not getting through the curriculum? I think I would just pause and I would say, but they are still learning. It might look a little bit different, but they're still carrying on and they're still learning. So they're still doing some English, they're still doing mathematics, they're still doing science, they're still doing geography and all of those other subjects. But we might just need to be a little bit more creative. The other thing to remember is that when your learners are at school, they're not always learning. So we often think that, learners are in school for 5 or 6 hours a day, but actually they're often not learning for that length of time. We know that there's movement in between lessons, we know that they have breaks, we know that they have lunch, but we also know that even when they're in the classroom and we have them for 40, 45 minutes, for example, they're not learning all the time for 45 minutes. A lot of the time you will be talking to them or they will be talking to their peers. Now that's a different form of learning, but it's that passive learning as opposed to that active learning. So again, it's just thinking about setting breaks when they're learning online, not necessarily replicating the quantity of tasks that we've talked about earlier on in the webinar. Again, of course, normal school hours don't necessarily work when learning online or using a blended model. And again, let's view that as an advantage. That's flexible learning, that's great. So one of the things that I would always encourage is that if you have a period of time where your learners are learning at home, rather than setting them daily tasks, maybe set them tasks that they need to complete over 2 days or 3 days or even a week. So actually, they have got that flexibility that if for whatever reason they can't access the technology or something happens in their home environment that makes it tricky for them to access the learning, rather than becoming demotivated and de-skilled and feeling that they haven't been successful, you can say to them, it's okay, you've still got tomorrow. I really would like you to complete your diary, but have a go at it tomorrow. And of course, trying to be really creative with the tasks that you set. I keep saying, home tasks are very, very different to school tasks. And there will, of course, be some continuity and consistency. And I also understand the pressure that actually, I can see somebody's popped in the chat box that, educational institutions are, thinking about that completion of work. However, what's more important, that our learners keep learning and they're motivated and they're happy and they're resilient and they come back to school kind of as sponges, or they come back demotivated because we've tried to cram in all of the learning. Every country, every teacher is in this situation at the moment. So actually, let's really be brave and let's say our learners are learning all of the time, consistently, continually. However, the tasks that they're doing just look a little bit different. The learning that they're doing is still there, but I've just had to alter the tasks a little bit. I think the Cambridge motto is perfect here. So the Cambridge motto is to prepare school students for life. And they do that by helping them to develop that informal curiosity and that lasting passion for learning. And I love those phrases. Are we trying to help our learners to develop that informal curiosity? Because that's what we can be doing if we're at home. That's what preparing students for life looks like. Of course, we want to get through the curriculum. Of course, we want to get through the schemes of work. But actually, it's not going to be possible in the way that it was last year. So actually, let's take a little step back. Let's pause and think, am I developing and helping them to think about that curiosity and that lasting passion for learning? Because when I get them back into school, if they're keen and they're enthusiastic and they're resilient and they've got all of those skills that they had a few months ago, then I can do the learning that I really need to do. So I think my final point is just to say, remember that learning never stops. but it might look a little bit different over the next few months. So let's think about this pandemic as an amazing opportunity. I know that seems strange to say it, but I'm very much a positive, let's look at every situation, through those positive glasses. Let's think about it as an opportunity to think differently, to be creative, to learn new skills, to apply learning in contexts that we may not have thought of or needed to have thought of before. So I hope that's helped. I'm going to stop and pause, hand back to Salisa, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for joining me with this webinar.
Thank you very much, Alison. Shall we move on to some questions that have been submitted in the Q&A box? So we have one question. I know you've touched on involving and supporting parents during online classes, but so Primo have asked how to lessen the burden of parents during online classes of their kids. Do you want to comment further on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question to ask, because it's really making us be very empathetic to our parents, and I think one of the ways to lessen the burden is to really assume that, or to really think about that, we don't want our parents to assume the role of teachers. That's not their job, that's our job. So actually, let's help them. Let's give our parents some encouragement. Let's praise our parents for supporting our learners. But like I said in a few slides ago, let's perhaps write them a message, or write them some notes, just to say, we're really it'd be really helpful if you could support your learners, and if you could ask this question, or if you could do this, that would be really helpful. But I think if we're setting tasks that we know our parents are going to struggle with because they haven't got necessarily all of the subjects that we teach, for example, I think the task, that task design is really important. So if it is a tricky task, let's help our parents by giving them some aid memoirs, certainly.
Great, thank you, Alison. On to the next question. I know you've mentioned something about doing the practical science projects at home. So there's another question about exploring practical aspects when conducting classes at home. There were some comments about arts and science, and one actually mentioned drama. Do you have any inputs?
I think that's going to be quite tricky. I mean, I think we have to be really realistic with ourselves and think that, at the moment, our curriculum isn't set up for online learning. I think that's the first thing to think about. So there are going to be things that are either almost impossible to do or particularly hard. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do those, but what I would be doing is looking at my scheme of work for the year. So whenever your new academic year starts, I would look at that and I think, well, actually these things are really, really hard to do at home. So rather than just setting them and carrying on as though learning, hasn't changed, I would be taking those things out and moving them to another part of the scheme of work, so that, in the hope that in 6 months' time, I can do those things when I have the learners in school. So I think that's the first thing. Of course, we want to try and offer a broad and balanced curriculum while learners are still at home. So again, it's thinking about what can they be doing. And it might be trying to have synchronous lessons in smaller groups, for example. So you can be doing some elements of drama, for example. But I think the other thing as well is that it is going to look different. It is going to look different. So let's think about setting those tasks that the learners could be doing at home, but we won't necessarily know how well they're doing. I mean, I know we've got another webinar coming up on formative assessment, and I can talk more in that one, but certainly, we won't, because we're not there in every single home, we can't see whether the learners are doing exactly what we think they would be doing in the way that we've set it. So there is an element of trust that we have to have as teachers to our learners and to our parents as well.
Great, thank you. On to the next question. How do we convince parents that the child who's struggling for maths needs their help?
Well, that's a tough one.
Indeed.
Yes, as a parent myself, I could see this with my daughter as well. It's hard. I think the thing to do is to really is to say to parents, your child might be struggling, but actually the temptation is, first of all, to do it for them. Another temptation is to make them do more and more and more, because we often think that if they do more questions, they'll become better at something. But actually, let's look at it from the other point of view. Actually, we learn best when we're happy, when we feel safe, when we're given praise. So I think we need to say to parents, just because your children are struggling, what you can be doing as a parent is saying, well done for keeping on going. I'm so proud that you've made those mistakes. Making mistakes really shows that you're thinking, really shows that you're learning. So I think it's looking at it in a different way. You then might want to say, as a parent, you might want to support, but of course you then you run the risk then of having two teachers supporting your learners. So I think it's about thinking of the other skills, the other emotional baggage that we carry in order to make learning successful. So of course, children who are struggling, they do need help, but it might not be at the right moment now. Again, thinking about, do we want our learners to really keep kind of thinking about, I can do this, I can keep going, I can, I am okay at maths. Just because I'm getting lots of things wrong, it's okay. And I think sometimes saying to parents, that's okay, that's part of what we do at school. We have that, that problem solving, developing resilience and so on. Hopefully, I think that helps. It's a hard one. There are no silver bullets on any of these.
Thank you, Alison. I think the next question will be, I think you did touch on this a little bit during your presentation, but there's a question on how do we make all of this work well when we are online for the full day running with a regular school timetable. Kids are in front of the screens from 8 until 2:30 p.m. So I think they did comment on providing them breaks during the online learning. Do you want to expand more on this?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it? Being online from 8 in the morning till 2:30. So the first thing I would do is I would definitely write a timetable, and in the timetable I would have lots of breaks. I would also have opportunities where we're doing the celebration, so it's not 8 until 2:30 of tasks and learning and questions, because that's really draining. So certainly you might start off at 8 o'clock by saying, what have we been doing? Who had a good night's sleep? What's the weather like? Lots of different things. Who's got a favourite number? Those types of things. And I could mention another webinar that we're doing as well about the fun virtual classroom, because I was thinking about this that we've been doing as well. And so we are going to host that. I can't remember when, next week or the week after. Really trying to think about how to keep online learning fun, and so making kind of getting your students to bring objects. For example, tomorrow I want everybody to bring their favourite object, for example. So actually what we're doing is we're not learning constantly academically in that window. So we have got some time to do some celebrations, we have got some times to do some breaks, and also that's when you can get in your drama, isn't it? Everybody stand up, everybody do something, everybody do whatever it is, run around like an atom, those types of things.
Thank you. I think that's one popular question. How do we deal with irregular learners during online classes?
How do we deal with what, sorry?
Irregular learners during online classes.
So is this learners who kind of dip in and out of accessing the learning? Yeah, I mean it's tough. It's tough, isn't it? I think the first question to ask is why are they irregular? Is it because there is a problem with the technology? If so, can we give them some more things to do offline? Is it that, you know, they just don't, you know, they don't want to be on the screen, for example? I know that, you know, I've been talking to some of my teachers who have got very young learners, and they just don't get this idea of being on the screen. So they don't want to. It makes them feel nervous. So I think it's about saying, well, you know, let's all create our own avatar, for example, or, you know, let's all wear a hat today, or, you know, those types of things. So I think the first thing is really trying to find out why your learners are, you know, attending irregularly. That would be my first thing. And then really kind of start from there, because it could be technology, but it also could be a lack of motivation. So again, well, what would you like to do? You know, you can be the teacher tomorrow. I'm going to, you know, if you turn up to the lesson, you're in charge. What are we going to talk about? What questions are you going to plan? So really trying to kind of, you know, get them back in from that way. But at the end of the day, if they're irregular learners, that it's hard. And it's happening all over the world.
Indeed. Thank you, Liston. I think we have a question about well-being of our educators. How can we help educators to be not stressed up during online classes, because majority of teachers are under stressful situation?
Yes, totally agree. I think the first thing is to recognise that the curriculum that we have, the schemes of work that we have, they were not written for online learning. So I think the first thing is that I would say, you know, to our educators, you know, try not to worry too much. You are doing an amazing job. You know, you're taking a curriculum that was designed to be taught in school with these amount of hours, with these resources, and you're now having to shift it into a totally new context. So first of all, don't worry if it's not quite going to plan. Secondly, as I've already said, it's going to be really difficult to replicate, just, you know, to lift it here and do it over here. So again, I think it's about giving yourself the kind of the reassurance that it's okay. You know, we're all in this, you know, learning together. What I said to one of my teachers a couple of weeks ago, do you remember when you were, you know, when you went to teaching school to become a teacher, you never thought that you would ever be able to stand up in front of students and teach. And now, you know, you're a lead practitioner. Well, in a way, we're all in this boat. We're all now, you know, kind of newly qualified teachers learning online. And it's okay to feel nervous. It's okay to feel worried. Try not to feel stressed. I know that's a really hard thing just to be able to say, but you know, if you're setting learning and you're trying to be a little bit creative as well and think about your learners and be empathetic towards what they can be doing, you're doing brilliantly. You're doing really, really well. So actually give yourselves a pat on the back. You know, don't be too hard on yourselves.
It's great. Thank you. We have one question here. What will be the ideal screen time for students for different levels?
It's a good question. And actually, there doesn't seem to be any kind of one right answer, which I know is a bit frustrating. But I think, you know, we often talk about sort of 20 to 30 minutes at a time, particularly for our young, I mean, and that's probably for primary learners, even younger. So sort of our, you know, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, probably even just 10 or 15 minutes. But certainly kind of ideal screen time, when you're wanting them to learn and engage in an active way, I think 20 to 30 minutes is more than enough. I watch my daughter. She's very good at, you know, she's attached to her phone and she's playing games, but what she's doing there is she's engaged passively. And it's the difference between learning actively and learning passively. So it might look like our learners can stay on screens for a long time, but actually, because they're not actively learning, they're not having to do things, it is a different type of learning. So that active academic learning, around about 20 to 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer for older students, but certainly I've noticed, you know, I've done so many webinars over the last 4 months, you know, mainly with adults, and we have learnt that actually half an hour to 40 minutes is more than enough time. And we're adults, we're used to sitting down and concentrating. So if 40 minutes is you know, probably the maximum amount of time for us to fully maintain and engage, then it's going to be less for our learners.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison. Let's go to maybe two more questions before we end the session. We have one here. Can you give examples of differentiation in online learning?
I think probably the main route I would go down for differentiation is differentiation by outcome. So I would offer some open-ended tasks that learners can access at their own level. So for example, if I'll give a mathematics example, if I was to set 5 questions that are very closed, so let's say, for example, we're adding 2-digit numbers together. So I could write 5 questions, 23 add 47, 68 add 19, and so on. If I'm setting those kinds of questions, it's going to be hard to set differentiation. Of course, I could make the questions harder as I go through, but really that's just, giving, more able students more to do. And that's not necessarily the route for differentiation. So I could turn that question on its head and I could say to learners, how many different ways can you pick 2 different numbers, and how many different ways can you add them together, for example? So I could say 19 add 36, but how many different ways could you add them together? Now learners could add them, they could do it once, but some learners might do it 10 times, so that you've got the differentiation there, but the differentiation has been created from offering an open-ended rich task. Now we can't always do that, but if we can make sure that we have a mixture of closed and open tasks across the subjects, then we're providing that differentiation. And then of course, if we go to thinking about how we motivate our learners, then that motivation is linked to differentiation. So if I'm motivating my learners and saying, Hannah did this amazing, she did 3 calculations. Wow, I thought she was only going to do 1. You might have some learners thinking, oh, well, I could do 3 calculations next time. In fact, I might be able to do 4. So that motivation is really heavily linked, but certainly open-ended, rich tasks is where I would go across the subjects.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison. So for the last question, there's a question here about if we do not map the remote learning with the curriculum, in your opinion, will the learners find it difficult to resume once back to school?
I think the learners are going to find it really difficult coming back to school if they haven't been doing some form of learning, if they're demotivated. I actually think picking up the curriculum isn't going to be that much of a problem. Because if we think about, learners, over the course of time have had, periods of time away from school for medical reasons or religious reasons or family reasons. And actually what we find is that they come back to school and within a couple of days they've bounced back because they have been learning. They've only not been kind of, learning in the way that they were learning previously since March. It's not actually that much of time. What I think they will find really hard are the skills of learning. So things like, have they kept on thinking? Have they been reflective? Have they been reasoning? Have we given them opportunities to explain and convince and problem solve? Have we given them opportunities to collaborate in some form or another? So I think, those kind of skills are going to be the ones, so maybe the social side of learning, they're going to find more difficult, which is why, I'm very much of the opinion, try and really get them to have those open tasks, really encourage them to be resilient and persevere with their learning, because I think that's the area that we're going to see that's going to be slightly problematic. If they come back to school and they can't remember, I don't know, their multiplication times tables, it's not going to be the end of the world. We're going to be able to do something about that. If they can't remember, nouns and pronouns and whatever it is, we can do that. But can they remember how to learn, how to sit down and how to think and how to reason? That's going to be more of a problem. So I think the answer in a nutshell is, I think they will be okay. And remember, everybody is in this situation. So hopefully that's helpful.
That's great, Alison. Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of our session today. Thank you very much, Alison, for sharing so much today. I personally find it very helpful, and I hope everyone who have attended today feel the same way. Thank you very much to everyone else, to all our attendees for joining us today in today's session. Like I said, we are recording this session. We will be sharing the recording to everyone who have attended. With that, I hope everyone have a good evening and have a good day. I listen to you. Take
Thanks so
care.
much.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.